Chapter 2, Discrimination Roots. In 350 BC, likeness and perfectionism was pondered over by secular and spiritual people like the man who made the Pythagorean theory actually uses his concept for the stand-in for understanding heredity. In this context, he might as well have called it Pythagorean theorem, since he based heredity information solely on it. To him, data was collected that remained in the male's body by mystical means. During conception, this information is given to the female body afterwards. Semen was perceived to be the data cloud within the male body, contributing nails, skin, bones, etc. This idea was called spermism, a body already formed on standby. The woman's body just helped the information across. This encouraged others to take the view after Pythagoras died. In 458, the writer Achilles spoke up for matricide, despite it being terrible even to his time. In his Emendis, he asked for the death of Prince Argos' mother. Apollo and Eumendis, speaking about the womb, stated in front of a court, "She doth but nurse the seed new sown. The male is parent. She for him as a stranger for a stranger just holds the germ of life." Plato, taking the math of the Pythagorean theorem, extracted a dark logic from the unity within the three sides, and argued that parents were mathematical units for the first proto-eugenics. For when your guardians are ignorant of the laws of birth and unite the wrong people together, the children will not be goodly or fortunate. Unquote. Aristotle wasn't a fan of women, but his philosophical take on women had their bodies being more physically active in the production of a child. He denied that men were the sole contributors of the substance of personhood by clearly observing that children shared features from their mother and grandmother's line, noticing the combinations of appearing and reappearing traits that I guess nobody saw or didn't want to admit. The material that Aristotle claimed women contributed to made sense optically. Menstrual blood. So once the woman stopped bleeding, he assumed semen and the blood would mix to create the child. Though he was obviously wrong, he was principally right in the dichotomy. The body on standby within sperm was eventually picked up by 1520s by Swiss alchemists Pericles, who was convinced by the myths of his medieval day that mixing sperm and animal waste, then burying it, would create a child, maybe like a human-plant hybrid. Another idea called preformation, which still involved the homunculus, but this time was a person within a person as a recursive pattern, hinted at by Christians to justify original sin, and could be seen as floating in our first parents' loins, staining us all in the future. Though most preformationists don't go this far, such as medical writers like Fortunio Leciti and Aromatari, who predate us, at least at conception. The Dutch physician Nicholas Hartsoeker claimed in 1694 to have seen tiny humans akin to the imagination of pattern formation in the clouds. Akin to seeing patterns in clouds and the moon. Another on the field was Caspar Wolff, who took from Aristotle his dichotomy of the different production method. The sperm and egg merge in some way, allowing things to come from scratch from a so-called invisible hand, in place for the vagueness of God. The battle of those who preach invisible hand or preformation raged on until the bottleneck of heredity information was reached in 1800s. Tons of Christians, philosophers, and proto-geneticists revealing the truth that ancient scholars didn't have the means to measure. In 1831, Charles Darwin boarded the HMS Bagel, while the well-known monk from Brno, Gregory Mendel, wasn't really good at taking tests, and was an unlikely source of future brilliance with botany through his style that nobody at the time could comprehend. Other botanists, that of Carl Linnaeus, who studied plants to realize that they have animal traits like sperm and egg sexual reproduction, in 1746 writing his essay, The Marriage of Plants, claiming plants live no less than animals, which paved the way for Mendel, who wrote of the struggle for existence among plant species, one being better or hyperbolized down the line as the fittest. But before Darwin left, he took some influence. Charles Darwin tried a couple trades before becoming what we know him as today. At first he tried the medical field like his father was, but was turned off understandably by the screams of strapped-down children amid the blood and sawdust. Theology barely attracted him until he gave that up as well, leaving Christ College. Either Darwin was trying to find himself, or he had some crisis of sorts, because he took up an interest in botany, bugs, and physics, and more actually. Luckily for him, he had some support by the botanist named John Henslow, Charles becoming an apprentice to him in his botanical garden in Cambridge, ending up as more than a casual hobby to identify plants and animals. Charles Darwin's interest branched off into mechanical aspects of biology, reading into the idea of the watchmaker by William Paley and astronomer Sir John Herschel's book about cause/effect mechanisms by reducing things to its tiniest particle, in a way taking away complexity from the bigger picture. But as a geologist, John could see the Earth in layers, which helped the overall understanding on that front, aside from reductionist thinking. So Darwin left on the Beagle with his new experience and with 73 sailors. The adventure was terrible, and he likely questioned if it was worth it. But along the way, he got what he wanted, gathering all sorts of rocks, bones, and plants to the point of irritating his crew, calling his specimens cargoes of apparent rubbish. Darwin would collect other things from the Galapagos Islands, such as birds and turtles, studying them madly. But he was unable to study the turtles because the crew ate them. For all the irritation Darwin caused, maybe it was debt he owed to the crew. Meanwhile, the monk Mendel was stepping up to the intellectual plate, though he was tongue-tied, awkward, and almost incompatible to his day. He strived to become a teacher, but he needed more experience than working at the monastery. Dead finches and mockingbirds were being grouped all around, assuming different species and measuring every inch of data he could observe. Unfortunately, Darwin classified them wrong, specifically called out by Charles Lyell, a geologist, and Richard Owen, a paleontologist, who both pored through his work. One animal on the critical table was Darwin's grosbeak specimen, but all were finches. Since Darwin lacked the underlying reason for variation, being simply confused by the reasoning for bird beak changes, noticing beaks that go after bugs and fruit, thus forming in the shape of a flute, and beaks that were meant for cracking seeds. This pushed the idea of the God center of everything away, thinking in terms of descendants that spread outward into the future. But how would haunt him? An influence of Darwin was right around the corner, though it wouldn't end well. Thomas Malthus, a part-time economist who studied how populations evolve out of disaster, got Darwin thinking after he read his 1798 essay on the principle of population, natural selection through destruction, whether by terrible seasons, plague, and starvation. Darwin immediately saw the issue in life. It at once struck me, Darwin began to write, that under these circumstances favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of a new species. End quote. Darwin's take was an implication of the fittest, but he never used the term we all know, survival of the fittest, which was coined by Malthusian economist Herbert Spencer. In 1844, his ideological turn to Malthusianism met him halfway, as his older daughter Annie died from some infection, and Darwin fell into depression, though still not giving up his work despite being unpublished. He could have easily let the heat of the moment